Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, professor of sociology at Western Michigan University, and I serve as the host of our program. And with me today are two political scientists. So we're going to talk a little wonky political science, maybe.
All right.
Denise Keele is on my right. She's a regular critical issues commentator. That's my new term for you guys,
Commentator.
right? And Denise is a professor of political science at Western. She's also affiliated with the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. She's the chair of the WMU Working Group on Climate Change, and she's kind of chairing the Coalition on the Climate Crisis in Kalamazoo, and
My de facto
yeah.
something there.
You're doing
I don't
a lot
know.
of stuff. Also with us as a guest is John Clark. John is professor in the Political Science Department and also chair of the department. And we had John on about a year ago to talk elections, so this is a return visit for him. So welcome back, John. Glad to have you with us.
Glad to be here.
And like I say, I'm going to get into some wonky political science for you guys to react to, I hope. First of all, Denise, there was an election last week, I heard.
There was.
And something happened. What was it? What happened?
So I know we talk about elections, it seems like a lot. We do consider this an off-year election, right? So there's no president, but there still were elections in an off year here locally, but of course across the country. And I think of most importance are probably three different governor's races that all had some sort of vote Tuesday. One still has yet to be decided, as we learned, and probably most important are the results of the Virginia State House elections. So if we'll kind of walk through them there. So our three major governmental elections for governor in Kentucky is the big maybe surprise winner. And again, we were talking before the show, what predicts elections? Turnout is always the political science answer. And I was looking it up this morning. Turnout was up 12% in Kentucky for this off-year election. But you've got the governor on the ballot, which is that's
going to drive
huge.
some, but,
total turnout still 42%, so not astoundingly
as Americans,
great.
we get excited when we get up into the 40s and almost up to 50, right?
When 42% is great and up, that's up considerably. So that's a very interesting race because the Democratic nominee was able to unseat the incumbent Republican Matt Bevin, running on things like climate and immigration, all sorts of progressive policies. But we should note Bevin, I don't think has conceded yet. Is calling for a canvass still.
At least as of this taping.
That's as of today, right? Friday, November 8th. I don't think there's been a concession yet. The last vote count was with the Democratic about 5,000 votes ahead.
5,000 votes for Andy.
I don't think we're going to see a big surprise if there is a canvass or recall vote for Kentucky. But that's a big win for Democrats for sure. The other two governor races, one in Louisiana and the other in Mississippi. Mississippi should be no surprise that a very...
Let me guess, the Republican.
You got it, exactly. It was an open race because the incumbent governor, they have term limits, and so there was an open seat, a new Republican, a new Democrat running against each other. But again, I think that turnout is the story here. The turnout was up, again, by about 15%. Almost 46% of Mississippi turned out to vote, which is also pretty historic in Mississippi. Now, a Democrat has not won one of those seats since 1999, so we shouldn't be too surprised at those results. But again, the story, I think, from 2018 to now is that voter turnout continues to increase. We are seeing a bit of a trend there. In both of those races, that's definitely something that made the margin in Mississippi closer than it's ever been at that level of a state race. So the third race is Louisiana, and we're gonna have to still wait for a runoff election for that particular one. There was Louisiana they have an interesting term for it, but essentially they use a ranked choice, or everyone is on the ballot, right? And then voters choose, and whoever comes out at the top. But there is not a clear winner, so they're going to have a runoff election, which will be
the top two candidates,
which will be next Tuesday, I'm pretty sure, November 16th. So maybe a week next Friday. Yeah.
No,
did you want to add to those guys?
It's actually on a Saturday.
It's a Saturday. I was thinking that has a weird. It's even weirder than I thought.
Yeah, Louisiana has the most unusual, idiosyncratic election system in the country.
Yes.
You know, there are lots of places that do elections differently.
Yes.
Louisiana does them differently than anybody else.
Yes.
And so this runoff pits the incumbent, who's a Democrat, against a Republican who didn't do especially well in the first round.
Right.
But the question is,
All
will
the other Republican candidates.
That's right. Will
Will
supporters for all of the other Republican candidates rally around the now one remaining Republican, or will some of those
Right.
folks either stay home or support the Democrat?
That's right.
Last time, the person that was the second in the first round, the jungle primary, sometimes
Yes.
referred to,
Yes.
the second place finisher in the jungle primary. All of the other Republicans said, no, that's not who we want. We'd rather vote for the Democrat.
Really?
That's right.
That's not the case this time.
Okay.
It's a more of an uphill climb in some ways.
Right.
But the fact that Louisiana has a Democratic governor running for re-election, not especially unpopular, as was the case for the Republican governor in Kentucky, you know,
That's
people are
right.
going to be paying attention next Saturday to see what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would hope so. You know, and it is Louisiana is so interesting, the timing of it, as you say, because other states, you know, a couple other states have this sort of runoff. Everybody's on the ballot. We decide that, but they do that then before you go into so that your general election day is usually then the cast off between the two highest vote getters, whereas Louisiana delays that process.
Right. They don't.
It's always
they
after.
just don't line up with
They-
anything by
they-
choice.
They absolutely, absolutely do not. And I think your point is absolutely right on the Kentucky politics. A very, very otherwise unpopular Republican governor for other reasons. The only other big news I think from Tuesday is the Virginia State House. Democrats won complete control of the Virginia government for the first time in like a generation.
So governor, attorney general,
The House,
the House,
Senate, all right.
everything.
It's a narrow, you know, there's a very narrow margins, which is something we should talk about. The partisanship, the ideology is all definitely there. But again, these elections, I think, are showing us two things. Turnout is increasing. Again, not the greatest margins if you're anywhere outside the U.S. Turnout is increasing, and really the evidence are, again, this rural political divide between the urban, suburban, and rural cores are shown again in all three of these races. And diversity, I think, is the other story, and especially the Democratic Party. The first Muslim woman elected to Virginia State House in this most recent contest. And Tucson, we have a first Latino woman to be elected mayor. So, you know, the demographics of our country are changing. Turnout is increasing, and it's putting different mix into these elections, I think.
Okay. Now, the one issue that I picked up on in looking at the results was what's been happening in the suburbs. And this is a trend since Trump has been elected in 2017, 2018, congressional elections, and now this election, is that there seems to be a kind of almost, I don't know if dramatic is the right word, but a pretty substantial turn in the suburban areas of our country away from Republicans to Democratic candidates. And so if we look at Kentucky, a lot of the suburbs, Cincinnati suburbs in northern Kentucky, helped to swing this election to the Democratic Andy Beshear. In Virginia, the DC suburbs in Northern Virginia, almost solidly Democratic. Now, I don't think I think there's like one remaining Republican office holder in Northern Virginia. But even in Richmond, I guess, in the suburban area around Richmond, there was this sort of turn. So what's happening with, is this a reaction against Trump? I mean, Jennifer Rubin, as you know, Washington Post columnist, who's a conservative, and but an anti-Trumper. She was talking about this in her column last week, and she said, well, the Trumpized Republican Party is vulgar, anti-intellectual, racist, and reactionary. No wonder, you know.
Well, that's a way to win over voters. I'll start there, but.
But she was saying that this is why there's a revulsion among these suburban voters who traditionally have voted Republican, but they're sort of repulsed by what they're seeing, and they're turning to the Democratic candidates. Is that?
Well, I'll defer to my boss a little bit on this one, since he studies Congress. I don't think that it's news to political scientists that there's a rural urban divide in voting. This is a trend that's been going on for a really long time. And as we see the urban core population and demographics shifting, we've seen, as they call it, the islands and dots of blue within a sea of red. And so I think that shift has been happening over time, would be probably the first thing that I would say about that. So I'm, again, with all things Trump, I'm never so sure that it's him or an immediate reaction. In some ways what we're seeing, right, are the results of conditions that have been happening for 20, sometimes 40 years in this country. So what do you think
John,
about
what's your take?
I think that's right, and we had traditionally thought about an urban-rural divide,
Yes.
but the suburbs are different demographically, and sometimes that difference becomes salient in an election, and sometimes it doesn't. And I think in 2016, what many observers expected was that suburban voters would be offended by the Trump candidacy,
Right.
and they would feel cross-pressured, and they would vote for Hillary Clinton. What ended up happening was Republican voters ended up voting like Republican voters in 2016. Whether that continues depends on whether or not those people remain Republican voters, or whether they look at the Republican Party and say, this isn't what I thought it used to be.
Right.
It's different now. And if it's different now, is
Right.
it still speaking to my issues? Is it still concerned about the things that I'm concerned about?
Right.
And if not, then maybe the Republican Party isn't my place. Now, those kinds of things happen all the time.
Yep.
We see the parties sort of ebb and flow in terms of who's a part of the coalition at one point and who's not. The South is the best example of that, but so is every other part of the country in one way or another. And so the big question is, what's going to happen with those suburban voters, and how well does each party speak to the issues that are important for those people? And it's sort of an open question at this point, which party will best address those issues, and whether that becomes a long-term thing or just a single election one-off and then it's back to the old pattern.
Okay. So in the last two elections, 2018 congressional elections and now these most recent elections last week, this seems to be a trend that's emerging. Is that something that you think is a reaction to Trump? Is it something that you think will continue?
I think it's largely a reaction to the Trump presidency, but in a larger sense, it's a reaction to the Republican Party with Donald Trump as president. The Republican Party with Donald Trump as president is taking on a whole bunch of issues that were not the issues of the Republican Party before Donald Trump became president. The consistency is maybe tax cuts, maybe.
Right.
But suburban voters in some ways are more likely to support paying taxes if they think that's going to somehow be a good thing. So if it's supporting education, for instance, if it's fixing the roads, there are certain ways in which suburban voters view taxation differently than some other folks do. It's a sort of a gross generalization, but it's consistent with the evidence that we've seen. Immigration is an issue where suburban voters tend to be, a little more in the middle.
Right.
But they don't like meanness.
Yeah.
Foreign policy matters to them.
Yeah.
It's not a front burner issue to them, but it still matters. And typically these folks are educated more than what you see, at least in some other communities. So they're perhaps looking at what's going on in the world in a different way. It's just a different subset of people. And when a particular election, set of candidates makes salient what makes those people different than rural voters or suburban voters, then guess what? All of a sudden they're in play in a different way. When the issues are, sort of not really salient to them, not addressing their biggest concerns, then they sort of vote the way that they would vote. And so I think what we're seeing, yes, it's a reaction to the Trump presidency, but it's not just a reaction to Donald Trump. It's a reaction to the Republican Party as it's being reformed by Donald Trump and his candidacy, and the way that Republican candidates are responding to the Trump Republican Party. And again, it's just not clear that that's going to appeal to suburban voters. But in 2016, a lot of those folks who maybe didn't like Donald Trump held their noses and voted for him anyway.
Right.
And that could certainly happen again.
Right.
Was it John Boehner, I think,
Yeah.
last week said something about there is no Republican Party, there's just the Trump Party. Now, is
That's
is
right.
that an accurate quote
Yes.
from him last week?
Former Speaker of the House.
Former Speaker of the House, and so there's a kind of recognition that there is kind of some shift in this party, and so some of those suburban voters, is this really the party that I thought it was, this is the party I want it to be, and that might affect their decisions in 2020?
Yeah, Denise said I teach Congress class, which I do, but I sort of think of myself as someone who studies political parties.
Yes.
That's certainly early in my career, that was kind of my bread and butter. We live in a weird time where political parties are really powerful,
Yep.
and yet they're almost completely hollow. And so it's possible for Donald Trump to completely remake the Republican Party in terms of policy issues in 6 months. And all of a sudden the Republican Party is different. And if you're not on board with this new Republican Party, you're out.
Yep.
And that's not just true in the United States. We see the same thing happening in the United Kingdom, in Britain, where the Conservative Party is remade
That's right.
at the drop of a hat. We used to think of parties as having, not unchanging, but change seemed a
stable
little
core.
more gradual.
Yes.
And right now it's sort of all over the place. And yet we live in a really partisan era at the same time.
Yeah. So getting a little wonky on the political science, and I did want to talk a little bit about,
Sure.
because I've been looking at some of the stuff that talks about how this increasing polarization and this partisan hostility has been going up in the United States. And from what I can tell is that political scientists are somewhat divided about this. There sort of seems to be two camps, right? So one camp focuses on the identity issues, right? This is the affective partisanship, right? Some people use the term tribalism, values, emotions, that kind of thing. And then the other group seems to say, well, no, it's really more about ideology and policy. It's ideas, that substance that drives the partisanship. And so from what I was able to gather, political scientists seem to be somewhat equally, maybe not equally, but somewhat divided on this particular issue. So how do you guys assess this debate, and which side would you tend to think has the upper hand in that argument, and how's that going to affect 2020? John, you get to go first.
That's a great set of questions.
I know. Oof.
So I guess the way that I would take that divide and sort of put it in layman's terms is, if I'm a Republican, am I a Republican? Am I Republican because I feel some sort of attachment, connection with the Republican Party, or am I Republican because I look at the two parties and I see what the Democrats are saying and I see what the Republicans are saying, and I think, what the Republicans are saying is what makes sense to me. I mean, that's sort of the general, the general argument. Now, once I decide that the Republicans are closer to me on the issues, then do I begin to feel an emotional connection with them?
That's right.
They're my team.
So it's not, these things are impossible to completely separate.
Yep.
Right.
But what it really comes down to is, sort of fundamentally, how does my partisanship get established, and how does my partisanship get changed? What we have seen over time, in sort of on a grand scale, in certain episodes of American history, but almost on a daily basis at the individual level, is people sort of feel closer to one party and then they maybe feel closer to the other party. Now, it's not that every individual is sort of ping-ponging back and forth, but in sometime around Franklin Roosevelt's candidacy, there's some disagreement among political scientists as to exactly when. We saw a big shift in support for the Democratic Party, not just in terms of the overall support for the Democratic Party, but in terms of which groups of voters voted for Democratic candidates and developed that relationship with the Democratic Party, that connection to the party. We saw a similar shift, a little more gradual, but a similar shift in the 1960s. Many political scientists argue largely around the issues of civil rights and race, as the Democratic Party became nationally more the party of civil rights, and the Republican Party, which in some ways had been the party of civil rights, sort of turned its back on those issues. That led to a shift. particularly evident in the South.
Right.
But quite frankly,
Nixon's famous Southern strategy.
That's right.
exactly.
Yeah.
You know, we went from a South that we thought of as being solidly Democratic
Yeah.
to a South that became solidly Republican. And at least in this, you know, these most recent elections, there are some cracks there that perhaps we wouldn't have anticipated. Again, because the parties are constantly evolving. There's a lot of change going on. But that, you know, how do people align themselves? How do people sort of figure out where they are? You know, it's sort of a both and. And frankly, it's different for different people. But when a party begins to shift pretty dramatically on the issues, then even people who feel connected to that party begin to rethink whether or not the party still speaks for them. And so it's not at all uncommon to hear somebody say, you know, I didn't leave the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party left me.
That's right.
Or I didn't leave the Republicans.
Which you're hearing a lot of that. I didn't leave the Republican Party, the Republican Party.
Right now we're in that phase of people saying, I didn't leave the Republican Party. But on the issues that are important to me, all of a sudden, you know, the Republican Party isn't what it used to be. And it's hard to imagine, you know, for us here in Michigan, it's hard to imagine a Jerry Ford being welcome in today's Republican Party, even in Michigan.
That's right.
Bill Milliken, who just passed
Milliken
away
was
a great example.
You know, great example of bipartisan. You know, things like environment. You know, my area, you would never see a Milliken today. That's,
But Bill Milliken was very much a Republican.
Absolutely.
He never doubted that for an instant.
Right.
But you know, the Republican Party isn't what it was. And you know that happens, and it happens on an ongoing basis. But you know, periodically we see big shifts, and you know, we won't know for years, but this could be one of those big shifts. And the demographic group that we ought to be paying special attention to are those suburban voters.
Okay.
So beyond those, right, of course, the other seismic shift in the conservative world is Reagan and the 80s, right, which has been the fundamental base of the Conservative Party since, right? And I think you're right. Trump is rebranding the Republican Party.
In the 80s, we got the Reagan Democrats.
That's right. And that was a set of issues and ideology that were paired together very effectively, right, for a long time. And then I think you're right. Then how does that become so hollowed out that here's the opportunity, right? Here's the mix of new change that can change a whole party like that. So one thing I would note is most of the when we put people into the categories of consistently conservative to consistently liberal, how we ask them is we ask you your ratings on a series of questions about issues. And those issues are the top 10 from like Pew, for example, are immigration, gun control, abortion, climate change, the work that I do. And so it is still an issue-based idea when we put someone in an ideological camp, right? And to me, it's always, you know, if you really want to get wonky, what are we really measuring? Am I measuring those issues? Am I measuring an ideology? Because they are put together. Some political scientists, when they go behind the veil and look at values that underlie those positions, that's where you see the biggest split, in my opinion. And there is a difference in a value base of I am more individual. I believe that most of my circumstances in life are controlled by me, and I have the power to change those, versus a more egalitarian, which basically is, you know, circumstances, some are beyond my control. There are systematic issues that affect who and what I can become. And that is where you see the underlying value-based difference that answers those questions differently on the issues that then end up being the brand of one of the parties, right? So the parties, though, still, for as much as the Republican Party can change in like 3 years, have a lot of control, as John said. I mean, it really is also the other thing that comes up is I may not be all for everything for you, right? Democrats have experienced this, Republicans have experienced this. So much of it today also seems about, but I'm definitely not for this other guy. And there's an anti-reaction that's happening that I may not be with you 100% issue or value base, but I'm definitely not, you know, a Democrat. So therefore, I only have two choices. What am I going to do? And you know, from Schatzsnyder all the way to today, right? The party is controlling these things, not the other way around, right? So
yeah, the one. Well, just to build on what Denise was saying there, that affective orientation
Yes.
goes both ways. So, the affect is the root of affection, and so it's, do I feel a connection
That's right.
to this party or this label?
Right.
But then there's also sort of the other end of that continuum, which is, no, I don't like them, and I know that I don't like them because of that label. That's
Right.
that antagonism.
That's right.
One of the things that that we have seen in the last generation and a half or so is that the label, so liberal and conservative are identities too,
Yes.
much in the way that party identification is. There are a lot of people who ascribe to one of those identities that don't really have much of a sense of what that means.
Right.
And so what have we seen? We've seen on the left Democratic candidates who don't want to be perceived as liberal,
Right.
because that has too many negative connotations. The term has taken on,
Right.
for some people, a negative, and so they talk about being progressive, or they use
Right.
some other label to try and differentiate themselves from whatever negativism
Socialist.
there may be associated with that other label. We live in a crazy time when liberal becomes a dirty word, and
Right.
somehow socialist is seen as somehow less
so.
in American, in the context of American politics.
So true. I would just add the other category of voters that we should be looking at, it definitely is the suburban voters. The other category of voters, and this is part of my other hat at Western with We Vote, is youth vote. And all the polling on our millennials and Gen Z, which is the next crop of folks who are about to become 18 and be 40% of the electorate in 2020, right? If these folks just voted, their value bases and their answers to those issue questions are very different. There is an intergenerational divide as well that we should be paying a lot of attention to, especially I'm very cognizant of it in environment and climate change. Young Republicans look very similar to moderate Democrats at any age on things like climate and environment and some of the more civil rights, gay marriage, those kinds of issues, right? They don't have those same bonds with the issue or the party, and they might be moving their own party in a different direction in the future. So
It's
let's pay
interesting.
attention to them.
The Washington Post ABC news poll from just, I think, last week, the biggest split, whether you, was 22% in favor of Trump, 72% opposed to Trump. That was the largest gap of any of the other categories that they looked at. For women, it was 31-64, 31 approving, 64 showing disapproval. So, but again, 22-72 for the youth. That's a pretty big gap.
That is the group again. If they only voted,
Right.
they might rule the world. Yeah.
So I want to bring in the issue of the Trump base. Right? What is the Trump base? How does that fit into
Oh my gosh, I know.
our discussion here? Because it seems that if you look down here, generally it's upper 30s to around 40 in a lot of these categories that support
Yes.
Trump. And the base, generally is thought to be around 40%, right?
Yep.
But it seems pretty hardcore. It seems like there's almost nothing. I mean, Donald Trump famously said it himself.
Yes.
I could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and it wouldn't affect me any votes among that base. So,
Right.
so what's happening with that base? Is this mostly now tribalism? Is this the identity politics coming in because it doesn't matter the issues, the decisions that Trump makes, that they're just loyal to a brand, to a tribe?
Yeah.
What's happening there?
So, well, it has been interesting that it does seem immutable, right? This is like a non-malleable base in so many ways. No matter what, seems impeachment, Mueller reports nothing, right? Seems to be able to touch
nothing
this.
shakes it.
But I think it is, when you talk to and when you see polls of still likely Trump voters and folks who are supporting Trump, they will talk to you about issues, right? The things that you will hear from those folks are, well, but we got Supreme Court justices who I think are, going to overturn Roe v. Wade.
Okay.
Right? They talk about those kinds of issues. Now, I'm from Iowa, as most of you know from previous shows. So one category of voters that I think that might be turning is my farmers, right? These are folks who have agreed with tax cuts. The one thing that maybe has, as John has said, stayed the same in conservative ideology. A lot of the tariffs, a lot lot of those things that are going on are starting to hurt those voters who would otherwise, issue-wise, perhaps be very aligned with Trump. But even that, like, has not yet dinged the 41%. So I'll leave you with those thoughts.
No, I think that's very much the case, and in some ways, it's tribalism or partisanship in some ways, but it's really a cult of personality built around one person.
Yeah.
It's less that these folks are loyal to the Republican Party in many instances.
Right.
It's much more that they've developed a loyalty to Donald Trump, and that's a loyalty that's going to be very difficult to shake, particularly if you buy the president's argument that everyone but him is corrupt, including the media, and anybody that criticizes him, including members of the Republican Party, have always been out to get him.
Yes.
And that if you listen only to the president or those media outlets that sort of echo the things that he says, then you've been yet to see any evidence that suggests that you shouldn't support Donald Trump as president.
That's true.
Meanwhile, for the folks who are looking at the entire situation differently and haven't fallen into that cult of personality and are looking at different media sources, just in instance after instance after instance, there's plenty of evidence to refute almost all of those arguments.
Right.
But if you're unwilling to even consider that evidence, then so what?
That's right.
I mean, we still hear people talk about the reason they support Donald Trump is because he tells it like it is.
Yep.
He's not a liar like those other politicians.
Right.
And yet, the Washington Post has a database of what are they up to now? 13,000
something like
instances
that.
where the president has given a false or misleading statement.
Right.
The fact checker for the Washington Post the other day said he couldn't keep up.
That's right.
Trump was at that Kentucky rally that Trump was saying so many false and misleading things that he couldn't keep up and, and even identify them all.
But if you trust him, if you feel as though he's the one who's on your side, he's the one that's speaking truth to power, he's the one that's fighting the good fight, then any criticism of that is
flows right on.
Yeah.
Because you've got an easy out answer that it is part of the conspiracy, right? And so when you see everything through that one lens, that's how it is.
Yeah.
And I think that is the unshakable, and it's much, like our climate science, right? We now know that the more I put facts towards someone who currently does not believe in climate change, that doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
Right? So what will it take, right, to either how do we let you out of your denialism? How do we pierce your veil of understanding, right, and get a different lens? What kind of value base do you speak to? What do any of these other candidates do to encourage voters to think about this? Because until that base moves, you're not going to see other Republicans move. You're not going to see things like impeachment, right, happen. I mean, that base is there.
All right, let's talk about impeachment just for a moment, since you raised that issue.
I said the I word. Sorry.
No, it seems pretty clear that the House is going to vote articles of impeachment, right? Which is going to lead to a trial in the Senate. We have no idea what that's going to look like under Mitch McConnell. We sort of suspect that the outcome will be that he will not be convicted and removed from office. There seems to be some ground moving a little bit there, but not nearly enough to result in removal. So how does the impeachment process now, which is probably going to go forward on some very strong evidence concerning the Ukrainian situation in particular. I mean, there are other grounds that one could raise for impeachment, but it looks like the Democrats have decided to focus on the Ukrainian situation. How's that going to affect the base? How's that going to affect 2020? Or will it not have any effect at all?
Well, luckily, John just hosted our Michigan Political Science Association conference at Western Michigan University, and we attended a panel on impeachment.
We heard from experts.
We heard from real experts a week ago. So how would you distill their final? I know. It's a mess.
I think the most important thing to remember is that this is really uncharted territory in American politics. I was mentioning before we began the taping that I'm teaching an undergraduate Congress class. My textbook doesn't talk about impeachment in the chapter on Congress and the president because
Such
so
a rare
far
phenomenon,
removed,
right?
Yeah.
from the other things that happen on a much more regular basis. It's in the book. I don't want to suggest that the book is is somehow deficient in that way, but they talk about it early on and sort of say this is the Constitution, this is what it says, this is how it divides up stuff, and by the time you get to that chapter on specifically on the relationship between Congress and the president,
It's not a salient issue at that point.
it doesn't
for it.
matter. Yeah. So that's just indicative of how truly unusual this episode that we're in is, and so we don't have a lot of precedent to sort of say, oh well, this is we know what's going to happen next because that's what always happens. Well,
We don't
we don't
have
know.
any idea.
We just don't know. Clearly, the fact that the House is controlled by the Democratic Party and the Senate is controlled by the Republican Party, clearly that makes a difference.
Yep.
Clearly, the rules of the process make a difference. So the House has responsibility for impeachment. We sort of use that word to talk about the whole process.
Yeah.
But the House has the responsibility to sort of bring the charges, the so-called articles of impeachment. That just takes a majority vote.
Yep.
And there's a majority of Democrats in the House.
Yep.
So if all the Democrats vote for impeachment plus throw in Justin Amash for good measure, then then the president is impeached. The next stage is at the Senate, and at the Senate, which is first of all controlled by Republicans, you need more than just a majority.
Right.
You need a supermajority. And so the question becomes, how many Republican senators are willing to say, based on the evidence that we have seen, some of which hasn't, we don't know about yet. That's the whole purpose of having an inquiry, is to sort of find out what happened. On the basis of that evidence, can we vote should we vote to remove the president from office? That's a pretty high bar for a group of politicians who have been extremely reluctant to this point to directly challenge the president on almost anything.
That's right.
Almost
I
anything.
mean, there have been a few small things that we mostly haven't paid attention to, but if you're not willing to challenge him on things that are much less significant, what's going to suggest that all of a sudden these folks are going to say, wait a minute, gosh, the evidence is the evidence. I need to do what I need to do. Could it happen? Absolutely, it could. At the stage of sort of the Nixon presidency, where we were just starting to learn about what was going on with Watergate and the cover-up and so on and so forth, early on there were a lot of Republicans who said this is just this is silly. There's no evidence at all that the president was involved in any way, until we found out that he was. We're still finding out. We're still in that investigative stage. For Nixon, when Republicans went to him and said, look, we can't support you, that's when he chose to resign. Nixon wasn't impeached.
He clearly would have been.
But he would have been. And quite likely he would have been removed, not only impeached by the House, the articles of impeachment, but in the Senate trial quite likely would have been removed from office
and
based on the
Republican
evidence.
senators who went to meet him were telling him.
And that's what they told him. They said, you can't win. It's clear to us, based on what we now know, that we can't, of course we can't support you based on that.
But that scenario doesn't seem likely in this case, does it?
Not yet.
Not yet, not yet.
It is a political question, as I think how our astute panelists would have put it last week. And if the polling is definitely increasing of Americans who think that Donald Trump, at least the impeachment inquiry should take place for sure, and that he should be impeached. That number is rising. Until it rises in Republican primary districts, you will not see those senators saying the things that they said to a Nixon. And I think there is an argument, Pete Buttigieg and others make this, that a far better repudiation will be at the polls for someone like Trump, because otherwise, if you continue to see it through the lens of the witch hunt, then you won't get there. So I want to make sure we get to 2020.
Yeah, let's.
A little
we
bit.
only have 10 minutes
We're
left,
only
so
like
let's,
3 months away from the Iowa caucus, and I asked John to talk about nominees and
So let's go there.
So tell us, John, what's the outlook for 2020? What are you thinking about from your position? Again, 3 months from the Iowa caucus, a year out
Right.
from the election. Predictions on tape today.
Well, you're going to have to wait for the predictions.
Okay.
But let me start just with some of the things that I've been thinking about when it comes to nominations, and then we'll sort of move into this year as a particular case. The first thing I think we have to remember, and that oftentimes people overlook, is that nominations are a party process.
Yeah.
We've talked a little bit about political parties in the context of party identification and whether people feel an affinity of some sort to a political party. But the nomination process, political scientists who study parties would tell you that's one of the functions of it's one of the things that political parties do.
Right.
In fact, there are some definitions that basically the entire definition is if you nominate candidates, then you're a political party. Right. If you don't nominate candidates, then you're not. So we have to recognize that this is a party thing. It's not just it's not the same as a general election. It's a party process, and the presidential nominations are sort of a really special case of nominations more generally because of the way traditionally these things have unfolded. So Denise mentioned Iowa, first in the nation caucuses.
That's right.
New Hampshire primary shortly on its heels, the first in the nation primary.
Yep.
Those are the places where candidates are spending most of their time right now because they're early and because in order to move ahead, you've at least got to demonstrate some amount of support in those states. But the goal is to get the most delegates, to get a majority of delegates at, in this case, the Democratic convention next summer.
In Milwaukee.
The Republicans will have a convention too. If nothing crazy happens between now and then, they're expected to re-nominate Donald Trump. But it's the party making that decision at that convention.
Right.
The role of voters is to select the delegates to that convention. And so we can get all wrapped up in candidates and this and that and the other thing. But fundamentally, nominations are about parties. And compared to other democracies in the world, our parties turn a lot of that responsibility over to individual citizens. We do things differently here than other places, but it's still a party process. We're still picking a party nominee. We're still picking the standard bearer that, the collective wisdom of the Democrats, however we define them, is that this is the person who best represents our values. This is the person who has the best chance of winning the White House for us.
Okay, and that Democratic Party right now seems to be pretty divided.
We don't even know what the Democratic Party is right now. And the same thing is largely true of the Republican Party, right? The Republicans don't get off on this. It's just that they're not very interesting in this nomination process. And so, in some ways, on an ideological continuum, all of the candidates are sort of between here and here. But in other ways, within that very small space, there are some pretty significant differences, and it's those differences that seem to keep cropping up. And the differences are based in some ways on ideology, but it's, again, a pretty narrow range of ideology on specific kinds of policy issues, where in some instances we're still talking about a pretty narrow range. And then on all of those other things that go into making candidates who they are. So gender and region and experience and so on and so forth. All of that other stuff comes into play too. And in this election, I think importantly, age.
Yes.
We saw in 2008 a very stark contrast between a young, vibrant African-American Barack Obama and a John McCain who at the time was one of the oldest presidential candidates ever. That generational divide spoke volumes to voters, even before just looking at those two candidates side by side, even before they opened their mouths, even before they said anything about anything. It was pretty obvious that there was a generational divide, and I suspect that for a lot of voters, that same generational divide is an important element of what they're looking at with this field of candidates in 2020, which still numbers at least 17. And if, it could be the case if Michael Bloomberg gets in like he says he's going to, then we could be up to 18. So 3 months out, and You know, we've got a candidate per week until the Iowa caucuses or something like that.
Pretty much it. So it is interesting, though, with that intergenerational divide, how many young folks support someone like Bernie Sanders, right? Because it's always this first, I think, effective, you know, and likability, of course. And are you the one who's with me, right? But the Democratic Party has a pretty big decision to make about where it stands on all within that little small variation.
It is a very small range.
Right?
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about, you know, the big debate this week is between Medicare for all or Obamacare plus.
That's right.
The difference between those two ideas is about this.
Yeah.
In the range of possible healthcare, you know, sets of policies, that's enormous. That's virtually infinite. And we're talking, and we're arguing about, you know, this really small set of. It's not unimportant.
Right.
But that difference is so small relative to what one might expect to see in a general election context, and what one might expect to see in terms of, you know, legislation introduced in Congress after the 2020 election.
Right. Yeah.
So who's gonna win the nomination?
Oh gosh, are we gonna make predictions? I don't know. There's still debates to go. Like there's still like 8 debates between now and the beginning of the Iowa caucuses.
So a while back, probably one would have said Biden has the inside track.
Yep.
Biden seems to have slipped.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, Biden seems to have slipped.
Well, Buttigieg is polling. It's a kind of a trio. Warren
seems to have moved ahead in Iowa and some other.
Buttigieg is 3rd in Iowa right now, so you know I get the daily reports along with the weather, soybean prices, and polling.
So one of the things to keep in mind about presidential primary races is that because of the sequence, because they're sequential, national polls aren't really very helpful. The state polls, what happens in Iowa is significant because people in the rest of the country are going to look at what happens in Iowa, and that's going to shape their decisions moving forward. What happens in New Hampshire and South Carolina and Nevada, the 4 early states that
sort of front-runner effect takes place.
So, you know, Joe Biden has name recognition. Joe Biden, people say, oh yeah, Joe Biden. Yeah, I haven't really paid any attention to anything else yet, but I know who Joe Biden is.
Right.
That support, by its very nature, is going to be soft.
Yeah.
Unless or until that candidate with the soft support is able to somehow firm it up.
Right.
And so, you know, here in Michigan, by the time we vote in March, it's not going to be 18 candidates.
No.
It's going to be a much smaller set of candidates. And so, you know, it may not even be worth my time right now to investigate all of them, or even the top, you know, 7 or 8. I might just want to wait and see who's left, and then figure it out. Now, I still might get asked in a national survey who I'm going to support.
Right.
But until we get to that point, it's you know, it's not really telling us very much.
Yeah. So then we're back to our classic answers of turnout will matter, right? And all of these, and the timing is really the interesting thing to watch in a primary process and an impeachment process, right? So how that impeachment process plays out with the timing of the primaries and caucusing beginning over these next few months will have probably a large effect on who's motivated and activated to go vote in this particular primary election, and then of course turning into next fall. So I do want to remind everyone that of course it's a census year, so it does also hugely matter who, right? In states like Michigan, where we Proposition 3, right, and different things to do citizen redistricting, those are caught up in the courts right now. But for many other states, census data is going to be coming in, and whoever controls your legislature controls your redistricting. So it's kind of a big year as far as those things are concerned as well. Lots of new rules to vote that have been implemented in Michigan that are in other states. We saw some of the effects of those even in just our recent local election. Folks able to go down to the clerk's office and register to vote, prove where you live, and vote right there on that day. So those things will affect turnout, right? And the different states that have all different rules, I think we're going to see some huge variation there. Some interesting things for political scientists to study, perhaps.
Always.
So I guess we should also point out that Well, before I do that, I wanted to mention Robert Kuttner's book, which is called The Stakes, and I think maybe we have a photocopy of the cover, but Kuttner makes an interesting argument that the Dems have to win this. This is a crucial election. This is American democracy is at stake here, and that the way the Dems win is through a kind of progressive economic agenda, and that so he's sort of arguing that a corporate Dem like Hillary or Biden is not going to do it, might squeak through and win the election, but will not produce the kind of change, and then might open the door for another Trump-like figure to come in who's even, better organized or more focused or whatever. So he really is harping on the pocketbook issues, and also to address the racial divide, because he says, if it becomes a matter of identity politics and racial politics, then the Republicans tend to benefit from that, as Trump did in 2016. But by emphasizing economic populism, in a sense, you kind of, hey, what's best for all? What moves us all forward in terms of economic issues? So that's Kuttner's sort of take on this. I don't know.
Well, I think we saw evidence of that in the 2018 midterms, right? I mean, the House, Democrats took control of the House, a shift of almost 40 seats. And how did they do that? With a unified health care,
really focused on the Obamacare, Medicare
campaign. Like here's an issue that comes, and I think we're seeing a little bit of that. I continue to be surprised at a candidate like Andrew Yang. Why is he gets the poll numbers, he gets the donation? Well, because he wants to give everybody $1,000 a month. Folks who are talking about some of those economics, I think that's. I think that Kuttner has a point there, but as you know, I'm not a believer in the savior complex. That Democrats could be just as terrible tyrants if they wanted to. To me, right, I'm an institutionalist. There are rules, there are procedures, there are processes, and there are responsibilities as citizens, right? So whoever wins, right, if we're not protecting the legitimacy of our democracy, that's number one. So a lot of the candidates are speaking to that, and that resonates with me. But
okay.
So Kuttner's argument sounds like the argument that an economic populist would make.
Yes.
And which is, if everybody thought like me, the world would be a better place. I tell my family that all the time. If you just thought like me, then we'd be a better family.
That's right. But
yeah, they almost never listen. What's interesting, I think, to build on what Denise said, yes, the Democrats were able to take control of the House in 2018, but the seats that actually flipped, most of those seats elected Democrats that were much more moderate.
Correct.
And had, military or government service in national security in their background. It wasn't, the ones that we have focused on in the freshman class of new members are the ones that are the most extreme. But those folks won in districts where Democrats always win.
Right.
And those aren't the ones that are going to be the decisive districts. And so, Donald Trump didn't win because of policy issues, because he was all over the place on policy issues. Donald Trump won because the people who supported him saw him as authentic. The people who supported him saw him as a champion that would fight whoever it was that they thought we needed to fight against. And so, sure, a Democrat might be able to build that sort of persona based on some economic populist issues, but just being good on the issues ain't going to cut it. They're also going to have to be perceived as somebody who is authentic, and somebody who can be effective, and somebody who is appealing. And if they can't do all of that, then the economic populism is not going to help too much.
Okay,
so who's going to win the Democratic nomination?
Oh gosh, no predictions. Wait for Iowa, whatever Iowa says.
I'd wait a little bit past Iowa, but we're the way the calendar is set up this year. There are these four early contests, but after that,
boom, boom, boom.
It's really front loaded.
Super
so
Tuesday.
March 3rd.
By March we should know.
No. But after March 3rd,
it'll be narrow.
There's not going to be that many states left, and so we could very well have going to the convention without a single a single candidate
That's right.
having a majority of delegates, something we haven't seen for a really long time in American politics.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we just have 2 minutes left. So one other thing I throw out there, we don't have time to talk about it. The Senate could be in play
I know.
this year
I
as
think,
well.
yes,
So
exactly.
Democrats actually have a pretty decent chance of taking the Senate
do.
back, given how the makeup is.
Yep.
Denise, so a couple things happened on the
Okay.
climate change issue.
Yes.
11,000 scientists came out and basically said there's
Yes.
a climate emergency.
Yeah,
The city
real
of Kalamazoo,
scientists.
thanks to your great efforts and the efforts of the
Thank you.
coalition, did
Yeah.
endorse that.
Yeah.
So that's happening. Trump has initiated the formal removal from Paris. We'll have to come back and talk about that.
Yes.
Fridays for the Future continues. So the
That's-
last minute we have what's happening with Fridays for the
So
Future.
right now, Central High School, right here in Kalamazoo, also declared a climate emergency, and they have leadership from the U.S. Green Building Council there trying to figure out how they will green their school. So I will note, climate emergency declarations are wonderful. They're symbolic only to the extent that you don't follow them up with these climate action plans and the level of activism and support that we are seeing in this community right now to do the real work that goes after the identification of your problem. So Fridays for Future continues. I'm very excited to announce Brandy Brown, the Director of Office of Climate and Energy, a new office for EGLE at the state level. It's going to be here for our last Friday for Future, December 6th.
All right.
So, and then we have a whole another semester to plan. I have no idea what's going to happen.
Keep going on after
Fridays noon, someplace
Fridays
in
noon,
town. Come join me.
all the way through to the end of the academic
That's
year.
right.
All right, John, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
being here. It
Always
was
a
great to
pleasure.
have you. Denise, good
Always.
to talk with you as always.
I know.
Thank you for joining us.
fun.
Please come back and visit us on Critical Issues, Alternative Views.